Today, we're going to be talking all about mastering morphology. So let me know in the comments, how much of an emphasis do you put on morphology in your classroom? Are you a 1, where I don't even know what morphology is, or are you a 10 and it's something that you focus on and talk about daily? And a couple of years ago, I was like, I don't know what morphology is. Like, I kept on hearing this word thrown around in literacy circles, and I was like, I don't know what that is. I don't know if I'm teaching it. Turns out I was teaching it. So if you're like, I don't know what morphology is, chances are you are teaching elements of it. And of course, today we're going to talk about ways that you can be more effective with your instruction. My ultimate goal for this session is really to convince you that morphology might be one of the most important uses of your instructional time. There are so many benefits to putting really intentional emphasis on explicitly teaching morphemes to our students. There's a lot of benefits that come from it, and I'm going to show you some really easy things that you can do, small shifts that you can make to make this much more of an emphasis in your classroom. Now, we're going to do this by talking about really 3 things. First of all, I want to make sure that we all understand what morphology is, why it's important, and then I want to share with you a really easy lesson framework for explicit morphology instruction. And then I'm going to share a super simple application strategy that will help your students notice morphemes and words they encounter, because the end goal is not that our students memorize a list of prefix, suffixes, and roots, but the end goal is that they can use their morphological awareness to help them read and understand big words. Just a reminder, today's deal, which is awesome, this is probably one of my favorite resources we've created, is our year-long word study bundle. And a lot of the things I share in this workshop are covered through these lessons, especially when we talk through that explicit or that framework for explicit morphology instruction. That is exactly how we have set up these lessons. You can find this deal at stellarteacher.com/word study. It takes you to our TPT listing. This is a TPT resource. It's also included in SLC. So if you're an SLC member, don't grab it. Okay, let's jump in. What is morphology and why is it important? So morphology simply is the study of words. Specifically, it is the study of morphemes. And a morpheme is an individual unit of meaning. If we think about, for example, a phoneme is an individual sound. So a morpheme is an individual unit that contains meaning. And maybe you're like, I still don't know what that is. That was, like I said, that was me a couple years ago. So there are 2 different types of morphemes. There is a free morpheme, and this is something that can stand on its own. It's like a standalone word. They can be combined with free or bound morphemes, which is the other type of morpheme, to create a new word. So free morphemes, examples, for example, happy, teach, phone. These are often called base words. And something that I learned a couple of years ago is that when I was in the classroom, I used to use the terms base word and root word interchangeably. But a base word has to be a word that can stand on its own. So all of those words that I gave, happy, teach, phone, they have meaning, right? All of those morphemes have an individual unit of meaning. They just happen to be standalone words. So the other type of morpheme, and this is what we typically teach our students, is a bound morpheme. Now, a bound morpheme must be attached to another word part. It cannot stand on its own, but it still has its own meaning. So they can be combined with free or additional bound morphemes to create new words. So, for example, the prefix un is a bound morpheme, the suffix is a bound morpheme, and the root tel is a bound morpheme. So sometimes you can take, bound morphemes, especially if you have enough prefixes, roots, and suffixes to create an entire word. But on their own, they can't stand alone. They need to be attached to other things, but they still have meaning. And ultimately, when we're teaching morphology, the meaning is, really the part that's going to give our students a huge impact on their overall literacy growth. So even if the term morphology is new to you, chances are you're already teaching it, because when we teach our students about prefixes, suffixes, and Greek and Latin roots, we are teaching morphology. Those are morphemes. So a prefix is an individual morpheme. A suffix is an individual morpheme. All of the Greek and Latin roots, those are all individual morphemes. So why is it so important that we teach this? So there's a little excerpt that I want to read to you from Shifting the Balance. And I remember when I read this, during our book study last summer. It was one of those that I was like, wow, this is just really like, it hits home why we need to be focusing on morphemes with our students. And they talk about how that in upper elementary, it is not uncommon for like a fourth or fifth grader to encounter more than 2 million written words in just a year, which is a crazy amount, right? Between all of the reading that they do at home and at school. And if just 1 out of 30 of the words they read is unfamiliar, they're going to encounter almost 70,000 new words. Now, if we are teaching vocabulary words, right, individual words in isolation, and if we are even able to teach 8 to 10 vocabulary words a week, which I feel like is still kind of a tall order, then we are only able to explicitly teach 360 new words maximum. But yet our students are exposed to 70,000 new words. So we have to do something to fill in the gap. And that is really where teaching word parts comes in, right? Because when our students have the understandings of morphemes, if they understand the prefix un means not or opposite of, then anytime they see a word that has un, they have a clue that will help them figure out the meaning of that word. Same thing with Greek and Latin roots, right? If students understand the meaning of those roots, when they see words that have those roots in it, they have tools that can help them figure out the meaning of those unknown words. And in addition, it turns out that the majority of academic words, up to 76%, contain Greek and Latin roots. So the reality of it is so many of the words our students see are going to have Greek and Latin roots. And the fact that they're going to be exposed to so many unknown words, we have to give them tools in their toolbox that will make it easy for them to discover the meaning of these unknown words. Because we know how important vocabulary is, right? That if students don't understand the words that they're reading, it's going to have a big impact on their comprehension. So morphology is incredibly important. Benefits of it is going to increase vocabulary. It is going to improve word recognition, especially when we get to some of those big multisyllabic words in upper elementary. If students understand the word parts, it's going to be easier for them to read it and decode it. And the strategy I'm going to teach you later on is going to help with that. But then ultimately, it's going to enhance comprehension. Vocabulary and comprehension go hand in hand. The bigger a student's vocabulary, the easier it is for them to understand what they're reading. So let me know which of these benefits would help your students the most: having an increased vocabulary, having improved word recognition, or having improved comprehension, or maybe it is all of the above. It's like, how can we argue with giving these things to our students? So knowing that all of these things are a result of teaching students about morphemes, we definitely want to make it a priority in our classroom, probably more than we already are. So let's go ahead and talk about, knowing that this is something we need to be teaching often, let's talk about a lesson framework that we can use for explicit morphology instruction. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I've shared it in trainings and on the podcast in the past. And it comes from one of Wiley Blevin's books. And he says, we want to create a classroom environment where our students are word watchers. But that doesn't happen unless you intentionally create a classroom community that focus on words. Words are so important. They are at the heart of what we read and what we write. So we really want to be intentional about helping our students notice words, and explicitly teaching morphemes is one part of that. So how do we teach a morpheme? When we're teaching morphemes, and again, when I'm saying morphemes, really what I'm talking about are prefixes, suffixes, and Greek and Latin roots. So when we're teaching these things, we want to teach them explicitly, right? That means we want to teach individual morphemes in depth. And this is not how I did this when I was in the classroom. I remember when I was a fourth grade teacher, I would teach Greek and Latin roots, and I would teach prefixes and suffixes, but we would teach this as this large category, right? Or we would teach it almost like a concept. So we would explain, right? I would explain what a prefix is, that a prefix comes at the beginning of a word, that it impacts the meaning. And then I would give my students a list of prefixes. But I never went in depth explicitly teaching individual prefixes or really individual roots. But that's really what we want to do in order for our students to have the knowledge of these morphemes, so that way they can use it to figure out how to spell words, how to read words, how to determine the meaning of it. So when we're teaching morphemes, the first thing that we want to do, and all of the examples that I'm showing you with the slides, these are examples from the lessons that are included in our word study bundle. So again, if you want the easy button when it comes to teaching morphology to your students, grab that bundle because it's going to have everything ready for you to go. but you ultimately want to introduce the morpheme, right? So you want to teach your students one morpheme at a time, give them the morpheme, whether it's a root or a prefix suffix, give them the definition of it in a student-friendly term. I think it can be really helpful to give them some sort of visual, whether it is a picture or an icon or a graphic. Give them a sort of an anchor word that they can use to help them remember that specific morpheme, showing that in example, really sort of going in depth when you're doing the introduction. The next thing that you want to do then is give students additional examples, right? Because in a lot of instances, morphemes sometimes show up in the beginning of words. Sometimes they show up at the end of words, in the middle. So they want to see a variety of examples. And one of the things that can be really great is showing them how morphemes can be combined with other word parts and how that impacts meaning. So in this example, we're teaching the morpheme spect, which means, to look or to see. And so we can show students that all of these examples, inspect, spectacle, perspective, they all have to do with how you see something, how you look at something. So students can really start to use their knowledge of that word part and connect it to the meaning of these example words. We also want to give students opportunities to build and define words with that morpheme, right? We want to give them an opportunity to create words. So a really sort of easy way that you can do that is by showing students a word matrix. So all of these words would have spect in the middle, and students can sort of think through, what can we create a word? So they could maybe take in and spect to create inspect. They could take perspective to create perspective. And then the goal would be that as you've taught students various morphemes and they understand, the definition of the prefix in or re, that they're able to use their knowledge to figure out the definition of these words. So giving an opportunity, we always talk about how we want students to really get their hands dirty and play with words, but this is an opportunity for them to build and define words with the morpheme. Then we always want to show students examples in context. Anytime we show students examples in context, it's really going to help solidify their understanding of that word, because they're not just seeing an individual word, right? They're seeing that word in a sentence. And ultimately, as we continue to build students' knowledge of the morpheme, we want to give them practice seeing the morpheme at the word level, the sentence level, and the text level. And I think sometimes this is where we have somewhat of a deficiency, where sometimes we can get so hyper-focused on just the word, right? It's like, let's memorize the root spect and all of the words and the definition. But the goal is not necessarily for students to memorize a list of words and their definition. The goal is that when students read texts, paragraphs, chapter books, articles, and they see this word in context, that they can understand what it means. So word memorization and definition memorization is not the end goal. We want that to transfer. So we already from the beginning want students to get practice using this word in context and using the context of the sentence or the paragraph to help them determine the meaning of the word. So teachers often want to know what order should they be teaching prefixes, suffixes, and roots. So when we're thinking about teaching morphology, right, or words, we want to do it in an explicit and systematic way. So explicit is what I just showed you, right? This idea that we want to go in depth. Now, the systematic way is there's a little bit more flexibility when it comes to prefixes, suffixes, and roots. Unlike when you're teaching phonics, for the most part, while there isn't necessarily one single phonics scope and sequence, you do want to teach in a way that is progressive, right? So you want to start with easier concepts and work to more challenging ones. So if you look at most phonics scope and sequences, they're going to start with consonants, then they're going to go to short vowels, then they're going to move on to blends, digraphs, long vowels, right? They're progressing from more easier concepts to more challenging ones. There isn't necessarily easier or more challenging Greek and Latin roots and prefixes and suffixes. So you have some flexibility when it comes to the order. But what we typically encourage teachers is we want our instruction to really be powerful. So something that we can do is teach the most common, right? What are the prefixes and suffixes and roots that are going to show up most frequently in texts? For example, I think the prefix un shows up in like 26% of all words with prefixes. So if students know that prefix, they're already going to be ahead of the game when it comes to looking at words with prefixes. So we want to start with teaching the most common prefixes, suffixes, and roots, but there isn't necessarily a specific order. So you have some flexibility. So if your school has a specific scope and sequence, or if you as a grade level have a specific scope and sequence, just know that as long as you are explicitly teaching them, that you're teaching them sort of in order from, most common to least common. And if you're sort of wondering, how do I balance roots and prefixes and suffixes? Start with prefixes because they're typically the easiest and they don't really impact the spelling of a word. Then move on to suffixes because they're a little bit easier than roots, and then teach roots at the end. So prefixes, suffixes, roots, but as far as which ones you teach, like I said, you have some flexibility. So rest assured there. Okay, so here's something that I think is just a good reminder, again, really hitting home why this is so important. But teaching even one new affix or root per week can equip students with a transformative addition to their word learning toolkit. Again, this is sort of one of those exponential impacts that if you teach your students an affix or a root, they are then unable to unlock so many additional words that they encounter. So let me know, can you commit to explicitly teaching at least one new morpheme or affix or root this week? So if you're like, no way, one, I still don't understand what morphology is and why it's important, let us know. If you're a 10, that seems totally doable. Otherwise, maybe you're somewhere in the middle. Maybe you're thinking one seems a lot every week. Maybe we can do every other. Let us know. But you definitely want to make this a priority. And something that I would encourage you to do is think about, how did you teach prefix, suffixes, and roots last year? And then try to do a little bit more this year, whether it is more frequently or bring it into other discussions or incorporate it into your whole group lessons. There's all sorts of ways that you can incorporate more conversations around morphemes with your students. So the last thing that we want to talk about is an application strategy that will help your students notice morphemes and the words they encounter. Because again, the goal is not just that students memorize a list of prefixes, suffixes, and roots. The goal is that when they see a word that they are unfamiliar with, they have tools in their toolbox that can help them read it correctly and figure out the meaning. So that's what I'm going to show you with this strategy. So this is the how to read big words strategy. And this poster is a freebie that we have. I know I've shared it with our audience in the past, so you might already have it. If you don't, you can get a free copy at stellarteacher.com/bigwords. Or if it's been a minute since you've used it, go download it again, because this is really going to help it sort of all of the things that you teach with morphology come together into application. So the step one is to have students circle any prefixes. So when I'm showing this word, I love using the example word disentanglement, because it's a long word. That word has 15 letters. And I know a lot of times when I was teaching and my fourth grade classroom, students who were less confident readers would see a big word and immediately they would just give up. So before they even sort of, knew if they could or could not read the word, they're like, oh my gosh, that word is too long. I'm not even going to try to figure it out, or they would see the first little bit and they'd be like, oh, disagreement, I'm not even going to try to figure it out. But this strategy can really help students take a big word and make it so much more accessible. So the first thing that they're going to do is circle any prefixes. And I think sometimes one thing that I just want to point out is that sometimes we tell students that prefixes always go at the beginning of a word, and they do, but sometimes words have two prefixes. Like this word, dis and en, are both prefixes. And so it's important for students to realize that, prefixes don't just exist at the very beginning. A prefix can be before a prefix as well. So sometimes words can have, two prefixes, but we want them to circle any prefix that they can recognize. Then we want them to put a box around any suffixes that they see. And then we're going to have them look at what is left. Now, if you're a student that, maybe struggles with reading, all of a sudden you've sort of eliminated 3 parts of this word and you're left with that middle section. Now, hopefully your students would either have enough reading skills that they might recognize the word tang, or they might even recognize the word tangle, or they might see the word angle with a T in front of it. So however they get to being able to recognize that says tangle, it doesn't matter if they look at it from syllables, if they know the word, like I said, if they see angle with a T, but hopefully if students are able to see the word tangle, then they are able to read this word so smoothly. So once they've looked at what is left, we want them to say the word part slowly. And something else that I think is important is to realize that when students are working through really big words, it is okay for them to approximate. right? So what that means is if they were looking at this middle part, tangle, and they couldn't get tangle right away, they might say, maybe that is like, oh, I see the word tan. So they might try tangle, right? Or they might try tangle. And so the thing is you want students to realize, okay, if they say tangle, it's like, okay, well, is tangle a word? No, we're not familiar with this. Tangle, right? That doesn't make sense. So encourage them to modify the vowels. So, if they're not getting it from the short vowel sound, try the long vowel sound or try the schwa sound, and encourage them to sort of manipulate it, approximate it until they can get to the actual word. So when they're at part 4, they're saying the word part slowly. So they have dis, en, tangle, mint. And maybe they need to do that a couple times, but eventually they should be able to say the entire word, disentanglement. And if they take the time to circle the prefixes, box the suffixes, and look at what is left, then they are able to confidently read really long words. And then you have to think, for students who historically struggle with reading, if they can look at a 15-letter word and read that with confidence, that is going to be a huge boost to their self-esteem. But the best part is that when you teach morphemes, not only do students have the tools to break apart and read these really big words, but they also have the tools to easily figure out the meaning. So if you've been teaching them prefixes and suffixes, they know that dis means opposite. They know that en means cause something to be. Ment is the action of. So they just need to think, okay, what does tangle mean, right? Well, tangle means to be either, twisted up or to confuse in a group. So the definition of disentanglement is the act of separating something from a tangled or confused state, right? So students now have the tools not only to read a big word correctly, but to figure out the meaning as well. Now, this does not happen for our students automatically unless this is something that we are consistently doing. So we need to make sure that we are regularly teaching this morphemes to our students, that when we see big words like this in the text, that we're using the strategy like this to break it apart, that we're talking about the meaning of the prefixes and the suffixes that we've already taught. And rather than always going to the dictionary to figure out the meaning, that we're saying, okay, what do we know about this prefix? What do we know about this suffix? Can we figure out the meaning of the word? Does that make sense in the context of the sentence, right? So it takes a lot of intentional practice from the teacher. But going back to that quote from Wiley Blevins, right? If we want our students to be word watchers, if we want them to be able to use their knowledge of morphemes, the prefixes and suffixes and roots that we're teaching, then we need to be intentional about focusing on words in our classroom. So hopefully today's session gives you some tools, whether it is explicitly teaching morphemes to your students or using that big word strategy. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident to make this a much bigger focus in your classroom this next year. So just a reminder, your sort of daily deal for today is our word study bundle, which again has all of the lessons in it. There are 20 prefix, 20 suffix, and 20 root word lessons. So 60 lessons in the entire bundle. Plus we also have our syllable lessons in there, which are helpful. So I think it's over 70 lessons that you get that will help your students really build their toolbox with words to help them, increase their vocabulary and increase their word recognition skills, which ultimately lead to comprehension. We hope you all have a great day.